In this video, I'm going to be showing a different way to get base colors to start your texture. The model we're going to be using is this low poly helicopter model. You can see it's fairly simple. The unwrap's over here, and then just looking at this unwrap, you can see nothing stacked. Again, if it was stacked, it would be colored red. There's going to be nothing that's going to be flipped at all either. If one was flipped, it would kind of be colored in yellow, and if it was flipped and stacked, it would be colored in red. So normally when we start a texture, we'll either have our model done, have our unwrap done, and just start painting right in Modo, or drop these UVs or an image of them into Photoshop so we can reference where the pieces are and just start kind of filling in all these little islands inside of Photoshop. But the way that we're going to do it today is going to be based off of materials. So the first thing we're going to do is go through and color this mesh with materials, and then we'll turn those material colors into the beginning of our texture. So I'll go ahead and speed up this part of the video. I'm just going to be selecting portions of the mesh and then coloring those with new materials. So just for a quick example, these helicopter blades, I'm going to hit M for new material, and I'll just call this one dark gray, pick the color, hit OK. And now these are dark gray. So I'll speed this process up so you guys don't have to slug through the whole thing. So now that that's done and there's kind of some base color on here, what I'm going to do is, you might have noticed that the smoothing changed because again we threw a new material on it. All my other smoothing was handled by just manually setting the edges to be hard. So I'm going to select each one of these materials and hit crease by smoothing angle. And what this is going to do is that smoothing angle, that was just something that I set. So now this is just reestablishing the smoothing to be exactly where I wanted it. And again, the original material was called helicopter, so if I open that up and look at it, this crease by smoothing angle is turned off. And again, to do this process and say where you want smoothing to be, as soon as you click that checkbox, it'll make everything soft, and then you'll just grab a desired edge, go up to this little joystick, and hit harden. And then that specific edge would be hard. So get something like this. Now if I turn the wireframe off, it has that kind of low poly look. But again, I just wanted these on select edges. So again, you can look under here and see the edges that I selected to be hard. So again, this one's not hard, this one's not hard, etc. Pretty easy process. But now that I have these materials kind of set, what I can do is really quickly, I can just look at this, kind of spin it around, maybe change my shading so I have the lighting a little bit more turned off now, so I can just kind of see what's going on with this and just determine, do I like it, do I not like it? If I don't, I can go in, let's say our brown material, if we wanted to switch this more to like a green. Same thing with the brown material here, this dark brown. You can switch this over as well. Maybe make it a little bit more dark. I can really quickly look at my model, change the colors, just pop it back to that brown color. But I can just look at my model as a whole and just change the colors and get a good feel for everything. So the other thing that I can do, instead of having entire pieces one color, I could maybe come in and say, okay, this is where I'm going to have the windshield at. It might not be 100% right here. I might end up making it a little bit round right here. But in general, I can have this color, the color of the windshield, and we'll just put it to that dark gray color. So now I can kind of see how this is going to look and get a feel for it. Maybe we even want to have this come back so the little cockpit area is a little bit bigger. They can see a little bit better. And again, I can kind of just play with this and get it how I want it before I actually commit to any actual color. So we'll probably call this good. Yeah, that should work. So at this point, I have all these materials in here, but realistically, I want to turn all these material colors into a texture image that I can then apply to all these polygons. So again, normally when we have something like this in a scene, we don't want to have a bunch of materials for one object. In most cases, again, that can differ kind of back and forth. But in this case, we just want to have one material applied. So what we're going to do is we're just using all of these colored materials just as kind of a temporary placeholder so we can generate a texture based off of these colors. So let's go ahead and do that process now. So this process is called baking. It's a little bit different than rendering, but it still uses the render engine. So what we're going to have is over here we have alpha output, and when we render this guy out, that's going to be kind of the black and white image of white equals there's geometry there, black equals there's no geometry there. This is the final color output. This is going to take material colors, textures, lighting, all that stuff into consideration. So what we want to do is add a third render output. So what I'm going to do is just right click and duplicate this guy. Now I have two final color outputs. I really don't need two of these. So this final output color we're going to change. So right here is its effect. So we're effectively changing its effector. So again, instead of this being a final color, we'll change this guy. So all you need to do is click on this little down arrow, or you could right click it, go down to material, and we want diffuse coefficient. So let's click on that. And now what we're going to do is when I go to bake this out, again, baking is a little bit different than rendering. It's going to kind of bake out my alpha output, my diffuse coefficient, and my final color output. And the reason it's going to bake all of these out is because these are my render outputs, so it's going to be what happens when I hit the render button effectively. So realistically, I don't need the final color, I don't need the alpha, I only need this one. We'll leave the alpha on just so you can kind of see what's going on here, but this final color one, it's taking all the lighting into consideration. And realistically, with it being on, it's just going to increase my render times. So what we're going to do is a really quick check. We have our mesh kind of selected and turned on. This little eyeball's not off. The unwrap is displaying over here. If it's not displaying over here, what you got to do is go to Lists, UV Maps, and then just click on your little texture right there. That's your unwrap. And then from here, back on the shading tree, we have that diffuse coefficient in there and turned on, and all of our materials are turned on. So we're kind of ready to go. So I'm going to hit render and then bake to render outputs. So again, these are the render outputs, and we want to do a bake. So we're going to do a bake to those render outputs. The render outputs being alpha output and diffuse coefficient output. So let's just click this and see what happens. So effectively, what happened here is it baked all of these material colors to our UV unwrap. So again, you can see we have the little amber colors for the lights, the red for the, I guess the red lights, gray for these helicopter blades, a lot of brown that's light and dark for the kind of body of our helicopter. So this image effectively is good to save out. The other thing would be this outputs. We have diffuse coefficient. If I was to click on this and select the alpha, again, the alpha is white equals geometry, black equals no geometry. So we really don't need both of those. So what we can do now is go ahead and save this out. So just hit Save Image and call this Helicopter Base Color and hit Save. So from here, let's open up this image and see what it looks like. Okay, so we're getting this scenario. And again, this is kind of intentional, so I can walk you through this process. But this color right here obviously is a little bit lighter brown. This is a darker brown. So let's take a look and see why this is happening. And this is always a good thing to do. As soon as you render something out, open up the image, compare it to your render window here, and just make sure that they're the same. And if they're not, we'll just go through these troubleshooting processes. So in Modo and most programs that have to do with color and printing things and whatnot, there's kind of different color spaces you can work in. So in Modo, up here you have this little thing that's LUT, and then it has a drop down and it has a bunch of little options in it. So LUT stands for lookup table. And without going into too much detail about this, just know that this lookup table thing is just kind of predetermined color properties. So this guy right here says sRGB. So this is going to be, if I change this to something else, it's going to change over here kind of the color space that we're seeing. So again, this one's a little brighter, this one's really bright, this one's a little bit more desaturated. So it was on this one right here called sRGB. And that, realistically, if I compare it to my actual geometry, these colors are fairly close. So comparing it to this one, let's say these are those darker colors that I didn't want. So what I need to do is, you can think of this LUT, this is the one that I can see right here. But over here is output color space. This is the one that it'll actually save to. So kind of a weird thing with Modo is sometimes these aren't exactly the same. So realistically, if I want my saved image, and this works with if I render out or bake out some texture colors, or if I render out an image that I'm going to use for a render sheet or something like that, pretty much what you want is this LUT to match this output. So right now we have sRGB and this one's linear. So again, this one is the one that we see, this is the one that gets saved out. So this one, output color space linear, let's change this one to linear, and you can see if I go over here and just pop up that image, now these two are the same. So it was saving out in the output field the wrong variable. So let's change this back to sRGB. So to make these match, if this one looks good, you just want to make sure that this one and this one are the same. So let's go linear, sRGB. Let's hit save. We'll just save over that old one. Yes, I want to resave. Now let's open that up and just double check that it's the colors that we want. And lo and behold, it is. Again, we have the lighter browns, and now this image we can use as kind of a starting point for a texture. So let's go ahead and close this guy. So again, that color space stuff can be a little bit weird, but just know that if this guy is matching this one over here, the color that you save out will be the one that you see over here. Pretty simple. So now what we have is, let's just bring this over. We have this guy right here that we can pretty much use as a starting texture. So just kind of food for thought. Sometimes applying all of your different colors as different materials like this and then baking this out, sometimes it saves time, sometimes it doesn't. This is one that you will kind of have to try a few times, and then after kind of the experience of setting up these base colors in Photoshop or setting up these base colors by just painting directly on the mesh in Modo, or the third way that we're doing now, setting up the base colors by baking out all of your colors like this, you'll kind of know from experience which one is going to be your fastest bet. So now that we have that texture image, I can apply it as a texture. So what I'm going to do is all of these materials that I made, we could think of all these materials as temporary materials. So what I'm going to do is just hit a file, save as, and I'm just going to resave this as helicopter_materials. So we'll hit save. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in and delete all these materials except for this one right here called helicopter. So let's go from dark gray all the way up to amber, right click, delete. So you can see all my color got removed. So I'm just going to grab all of these polygons, M for material. Now I'm going to go down to helicopter and hit OK. So now we have kind of a base gray color on this. We don't have a texture applied. You can see our texture is empty. So let's go ahead and apply that texture. Just going to grab him, drag and drop, and now all those base colors are on there. So we could start painting this pretty much at any time, getting details, doing a bunch of other fancy things. Let's change this back to default so we have some color or some shading in here. So now just a really quick thing you can do just as far as scene cleanup is if I go to texture and purge unused materials, just click on that. What that does is all those kind of behind the scenes materials, I know I deleted them out of here, but sometimes they can kind of hide in the background of your file. So just doing that texture purge unused materials, all those materials that kind of weren't needed, it'll get rid of those for you. You can kind of do that at any time to get rid of materials you don't have assigned to anything. So again, that pretty much sums it up for this process. It realistically isn't a hard process. Again, it seemed a little bit drawn out because I was explaining everything. Once you get into the process, you just assign all of your materials, change this to diffuse coefficient, render, bake to render outputs, save that image, and then you're done. So again, once you get used to it, it's a little bit faster. But just know that, like I stated before, this is a process that sometimes it's fastest to bake out these textures. Sometimes it's faster to do it in Photoshop. Sometimes it's faster to do it in Modo. Again, it just depends on what you're creating and then how much detail is in it. But again, this is just another one of those little things you can add to your bag of tricks that'll hopefully in some cases speed up your workflow.